This is the story of the man the Allies hanged for starting a war that historians now argue he lacked the power to stop. Shortly after midnight on the 23rd of December, 1948, Hideki Tojo was executed at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. 7 men walked to the gallows that night, and Tojo headed the list: the former prime minister, the former army minister, the former chief of the Army General Staff, the face that American newsreels had spent 4 years turning into the single recognizable enemy of the Pacific War. The tribunal that condemned him sat for 2.5 years, heard 419 witnesses, admitted 4,336 exhibits, and took depositions and affidavits from 779 additional individuals. And when 11 judges finally voted on whether Hideki Tojo should die, the margin proved so contested that the judges swore never to reveal it, and to this day nobody can reconstruct the count with certainty. That secrecy is where the problem begins. The case against Tojo was never that he was a monster. The case against Tojo was that he was in charge, and the closer historians have looked at what being in charge actually meant inside the Japanese state of 1941, the harder that second claim has become to defend. For most of the English-speaking world, Hideki Tojo arrived fully formed as a caricature: the glasses, the shaved head, the clipped mustache. Wartime American propaganda placed him in a lineup beside Hitler and Mussolini and asked audiences to read the 3 men as equivalents: 3 dictators, 3 war-making wills, 3 faces of the same global disease. That framing outlived the war, and it outlived Tojo. It remains the framing most people carry, which is why the standard popular account of the Pacific War treats the question of blame as settled before anyone thinks to ask it. The scholarship stopped supporting that framing decades ago. Robert Butow published Tojo and the Coming of the War in 1961, and for 6 decades it has stood as the standard scholarly biography. Butow's Tojo is no dictator. Butow's Tojo is a bureaucratic operator, formidable inside a committee, embedded in a system he neither designed nor commanded. Encyclopedia Britannica now states plainly that his power fell well short of Hitler's or Mussolini's, and political scientists working on comparative fascism arrived at the same conclusion from a different direction. Stanley Payne and others have stressed that Japan lacked the defining machinery of the European dictatorships: no single dictator, no mass fascist party, no leader cult of the German or Italian type. Roger Griffin dismissed the Imperial Rule Assistance Association, the body Tojo presided over, as little more than a bureaucratic fiction. The Japanese political scientist Masao Maruyama gave the system its most durable description. Maruyama called it fascism from above, and characterized the resulting government as a regime of collective irresponsibility, a structure in which decisions of enormous consequence emerged without any identifiable person having decided them. Hold on to that phrase, collective irresponsibility, because everything that follows runs straight through it. The distinction Maruyama drew is neither a technicality nor an exculpation. Fascism from above describes a state captured by its own permanent institutions rather than by a movement rising from the street. There was no march on Rome and no beer hall. There was a war ministry, a general staff, a privy seal, a cabinet, and a throne, with authority diffused across all of them in a way that turned every participant into a partial author of decisions none of them would have signed alone. A system like that requires no Hitler, and that is the entire point of it. Catastrophic outcomes emerge through the ordinary operation of committees staffed by men who each believe themselves to be responding to constraints imposed by someone else. Which leaves the question the propaganda version never had to face, the question of what exactly Hideki Tojo was hanged for, in a system where nobody was in command. Hideki Tojo entered the world on the 30th of December, 1884, in the Kajamachi district of Tokyo, the 3rd son and eldest surviving son of Hidenori Tojo, a career army officer who rose to lieutenant general and fought in both the First Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. The family descended from samurai, though from the lower ranks of that class, warrior retainers rather than lords. Butow and the biographer Courtney Brown described the household in identical terms: respectable but poor. Tojo's mother was the daughter of a Buddhist priest, and that detail will matter enormously at the very end of this story. Enrollment at the Army Cadet School came in 1899. Tojo graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in March of 1905, ranked 10th out of 363 cadets, a figure documented by the historian Alvin Cooks. Commissioned as second lieutenant, he married Kitsuko Ito in 1909, and the marriage produced 7 children, 3 sons, and 4 daughters. Graduation from the Army War College followed in 1915, then service in the Siberian intervention between 1918 and 1919, and 3 years as military attaché in Germany from 1919 to 1922. Somewhere in those years, the Imperial Japanese Army handed Hideki Tojo the nickname that followed him to the gallows. Kamisori, the razor. The name had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with processing speed. Tojo possessed a memory for administrative detail that colleagues found slightly unnerving, an ability to hold the entire contents of a file in his head and cut directly to the operative question. Paperwork came home with him every night, and child-rearing fell entirely to Kitsuko. The razor was an organizational compliment, and it captured exactly the kind of officer he was, one who solved the problem in front of him with total competence and rarely asked whether it was the right problem. His great rival inside the army understood this perfectly and turned it into an insult that stuck. Ishiwara Kanji had engineered the Manchurian incident, the staff officer whose conspiracy handed Japan an empire in Manchuria and set the trajectory for everything that came after. Ishiwara considered himself a strategist of world historical vision. Ishiwara looked at Hideki Tojo and saw a clerk with rank. The phrase he used was Tojo Jo Tohai, Tojo the corporal. Nothing crueler could be said about a general officer in that army, and the insult contained a real observation. The man who would become Prime Minister of Japan in the most consequential month of its modern history was, by the assessment of his most brilliant rival, an administrator without strategic imagination. By 1935, Hideki Tojo commanded the Kempitai, the military police, in the puppet state of Manchukuo, which meant secret police work, surveillance, arrest, and the systematic identification of political unreliability inside the army itself. The posting matters more than its job title suggests because of what it's selected for. A field commander is judged on ground taken, and a staff officer is judged on plans that survive contact. The commander of a military police apparatus in an occupied territory is judged on something else entirely, on the absence of problems, on the quiet that follows the removal of people who might have caused noise. It rewards thoroughness, files, memory for names, and a temperament that treats human beings as variables to be resolved before they become incidents. Manchukuo was the Guangdong Army's own creation, a state manufactured out of the Manchurian incident, and the men running it answered in practice to an army that had already demonstrated it would act without authorization from Tokyo and be rewarded for it. Tojo's function inside that arrangement was internal security, and the razor made certain the instrument stayed pointed where the institution wanted it pointed. That is the resume the razor carried into national office. The Imperial Japanese Army of the 1930s was split by a factional conflict with no clean Western analog. On one side stood the Kodoha, the Imperial Way faction, romantic, insurrectionary, drawn to the idea that Japan could be purified by violence directed at its own corrupt elites. Facing them stood the Tozaiha, the control faction, which held that the army should take power the way an institution takes power, through the existing machinery, through budgets and appointments and ministries. Tojo belonged to the control faction down to the bone. On the 26th of February, 1936, the Imperial Way faction attempted a coup in Tokyo. Junior officers led troops into the capital, assassinated cabinet ministers, and seized the government quarter. This was the culminating episode of what a generation of Western observers had already labeled government by assassination, a decade in which Japanese political violence had rendered moderate policy physically dangerous to hold. Tojo, in Manchuria, moved within hours to arrest Kodoha sympathizers before they could act. The coup collapsed. The control faction won. And the men who had spent a decade being murdered for insufficient militarism found themselves replaced by men who would achieve the same ends through paperwork. There is a pattern here that modern organizational psychology has documented exhaustively in institutions that never fired a shot. When an organization is captured by a radical faction and that faction is then suppressed, the surviving moderates rarely restore the previous equilibrium. They implement the radicals' agenda through legitimate channels, because the radicals have permanently shifted the boundary of what counts as a reasonable position. The suppression looks like a victory for stability. It functions as a ratchet. The February 1936 coup was crushed, and within 18 months Japan had entered full-scale war with China, with Hideki Tojo serving as chief of staff of the Guangdong Army, leading operations in the field, a post he took up in 1937. The men who had wanted war by assassination lost, and the war happened anyway, on schedule, signed off in triplicate. Hideki Tojo became army minister on the 22nd of July, 1940, serving under Prime Minister Prince Fumimaro Kono. On the 17th of October, 1941, he became Prime Minister of Japan. What happened next is the single strongest piece of evidence for the dictator thesis, and it deserves to be laid out in full before it gets taken apart. Tojo did not simply become Prime Minister. Tojo became Prime Minister while remaining Army Minister, and simultaneously took the Home Ministry, which controlled the National Police, holding it from October of 1941 to February of 1942. Over the course of the premiership, he also personally held the Foreign Ministry in September of 1942, the Education Ministry in April of 1943, Commerce and Industry from October to November of 1943, and the newly created Munitions Ministry from the 1st of November, 1943. Presiding over the Imperial Rule Assistance Association, the single legal political organization in the country, completed the collection. And then, on the 21st of February, 1944, Hideki Tojo took the post of Chief of the Army General Staff. That last step has no equivalent anywhere in the other Axis states. It fused the civilian premiership with the supreme uniformed command of the army in one man. By early 1944, Tojo simultaneously held the premiership, the Army Ministry, the Munitions Ministry, and the top operational post in the Imperial Japanese Army. On paper, that is a dictatorship. Except that dictators have no need to collect offices, because dictators issue orders. The accumulation of portfolios is what weak executives do inside strong bureaucracies. Every ministry Tojo absorbed was a ministry that had proven capable of obstructing him. The Munitions Ministry came into existence because industrial production was failing and no existing body could compel the Army and Navy to stop competing for the same steel. The General Staff position followed in February of 1944 because the Army High Command was pursuing operations the Cabinet could not coordinate. Each acquisition looks like a seizure of power. Each acquisition was a confession that the previous arrangement had failed. The structural detail that makes this legible is one Western accounts routinely skip. The Japanese Army and Navy were not branches of a unified defense establishment answering to a government. They were rival institutions with independent access to the throne, competing for the same finite steel, the same finite fuel, the same finite industrial capacity, and each capable of collapsing a cabinet by withdrawing its serving minister. A Japanese prime minister did not command the armed forces. A Japanese prime minister negotiated with them. This is why the Munitions Ministry had to be invented in November of 1943, and why Tojo had to run it personally. No existing body possessed the authority to tell the Navy and the Army which of them would receive a given quantity of steel, and the two services had been resolving that question by competition for a decade, at a cost the country could no longer absorb. And this is why the February 1944 seizure of the General Staff position reads so differently in context than it does in a list. Tojo took supreme operational command of the Army because the Army's operational command was making decisions the government could not coordinate with the war it was supposedly fighting. The most powerful man in Japan acquired that post the way a man grabs a railing. The decisive proof arrives in July of 1944, when the system that supposedly served Hideki Tojo removed Hideki Tojo. Saipan fell on the 9th of July, 1944, and Tojo resigned on the 18th, 9 days later. Adolf Hitler was never voted out of the German state. Tojo, holder of 4 simultaneous offices including Supreme Command of the Army, was gone inside a fortnight of a lost island. To understand the decision he presided over in the autumn of 1941, the numbers have to come first, because the numbers are what the decision-makers in Tokyo were actually looking at. On the 26th of July, 1941, the United States froze Japanese assets, and the oil stopped. The scale of Japan's exposure is contested at the margins, but not in substance. Stephen Wolborski's study for the United States Air Force, Chokehold, states that the American action removed 80% of Japan's oil imports with the stroke of a pen. Other sources place the figure higher, at roughly 88%, and some at 90%. Wolborski adds the detail that makes the number bite. The Imperial Japanese Navy owned 88% of Japan's refined fuel stocks, consumed more fuel than any other institution in the country, and was burning through reserves at a rate of 1 million barrels a month. Japan's total stockpile stood at approximately 43 million barrels, which at wartime consumption came to under 2 years of fuel. After the asset freeze, Japan lost roughly 3/4 of its overseas trade. The country facing Japan across the Pacific produced, in 1941, over 60% of the world's petroleum. This is the arithmetic that sat on the table in Tokyo in October of 1941 when Hideki Tojo became prime minister. Every month of negotiation consumed fuel that could not be replaced, and every month of delay made the Navy weaker relative to the enemy it might eventually have to fight. The clock never ran toward a better position. The clock ran toward paralysis. 2 schools of historians have fought over what that arithmetic meant. The structural reading, developed most fully in Michael Barnhart's Japan Prepares for Total War and in Ari Hata's Japan 1941, treats resource pressure and dysfunctional consensus-bound decision-making as the engine. Japan went to war fatalistically, as a gamble, because the alternative was a slow strangulation the political system proved incapable of accepting. The ideological reading, developed by Sadao Asada and others, insists that the embargo cannot be separated from what Japan was being embargoed for. The oil was cut off because of the war in China, and the war in China proceeded from Pan-Asianism, from the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, from a set of imperial and racial commitments that no resource calculation produced. Most current scholarship integrates both. What the scholarship agrees on is narrower and considerably more damaging to the popular account. The decision was collective. The decision was structural. The decision was not the will of one man, and Hideki Tojo, who had been prime minister for roughly 7 weeks when the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, did not originate it. Hideki Tojo did not become prime minister in order to start a war. The premiership came to him because Prince Fumimaro Kono could not resolve the deadlock and resigned, and because Kito Koichi, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal and the man who managed access to the throne, recommended him for the job. The logic behind that recommendation ranks among the strangest things in the entire record. Kito's calculation, as the surviving documentation presents it, was that only an army man with impeccable hardline credentials could deliver the army to a negotiated settlement. A moderate premier ordering the army to stand down in China would have been ignored or killed. The razor might be obeyed. Tojo was appointed, in part, because Tojo was the one man who could plausibly have stopped it. That is not how it went. Through the liaison and imperial conferences of early November 1941, the machinery moved toward a deadline rather than a decision. Negotiations with the United States would continue to a fixed date, and if no settlement arrived by that date, the fuel arithmetic would take over and the operation would proceed. Nobody in the room had to say the word yes. The system was constructed so that war arrived through the expiration of a timetable. The reason so much is known about the internal deliberations of that autumn comes down to a single document, and it became the most important piece of evidence the prosecution possessed at Tokyo 7 years later. Kito Koichi kept a diary. As Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, Kido sat at the junction between the throne, the cabinet, and the senior statesman, and he recorded what passed through it. The Kido Diary is the reason the tribunal could reconstruct who met whom, when, and to what purpose across the entire approach to war. Kido himself was indicted and received life imprisonment. His own record helped convict the men he had spent a decade managing. What that record shows about the road to December 1941 is not a leader overriding opposition. It shows a machine reaching a state in which no participant possessed both the authority and the standing to halt it. The army could not accept withdrawal from China without repudiating a decade of its own dead. The Navy would not state plainly that it expected to lose, because saying so would forfeit its budget and its institutional position. So it hedged, and the hedge was read as assent. The civilian ministries lacked the constitutional footing to overrule either service. And the fuel gauge kept falling. Hideki Tojo, appointed to be the one man capable of delivering the army to a settlement, discovered on arrival that the army would not be delivered, and that the office he now held could not compel it. There is a phrase from this period that has followed him through every account written since. Sometimes one must have the courage to close one's eyes and jump off the veranda of the Kiyamizu Temple. Kiyamizura in Kyoto has a wooden platform standing high above a slope, and the image of leaping from it is an old Japanese expression for taking an irreversible plunge. It needs flagging carefully, because this is a stock idiom rather than a phrase Hideki Tojo invented. The historian Richard Samuels documents the attribution in securing Japan, and Britannica carries it. But what the line captures is the mood of the whole planning apparatus rather than the private psychology of one man, which is precisely what makes it useful. It is the language of a system that has stopped calculating and started jumping. On the 7th of December, 1941, across the international date line on the 8th in Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked Pearl Harbor. Hideki Tojo had been prime minister for approximately 7 weeks. The war he presided over was decided by production, and the production figures are not close. Research presented at Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies International Forum on War History in 2011 sets out the raw disparity. Across the war, the United States built roughly 325,000 combat aircraft, while Japan built approximately 76,000. The United States held roughly 7 times Japan's coal, 13 times its steel, and 222 times its oil. One figure isolates the problem completely. American aircraft production peaked at 96,318 units in the single year of 1944, and that one year exceeded Japan's total aircraft production for the entire war. The Japanese response was not indolence. It was the opposite, and this is where the story becomes genuinely tragic rather than merely doomed. Ian Toll documents the mobilization in Twilight of the Gods. 17% of the Japanese economy went to war production, against 2.6% of the American economy. Japanese munitions production rose sharply after 1941 and approached 50% of gross domestic product by 1944. Japan was straining harder than the United States by a factor of 6 and losing anyway. Analysts who study institutional collapse in modern finance describe a specific failure mode that maps onto this with uncomfortable precision. An organization facing a solvency problem it cannot solve will reliably convert it into a liquidity problem it can appear to manage. The underlying position is unrecoverable, so effort gets redirected into activity that produces visible motion, faster cycles, harder work, more aggressive targets. Because motion is measurable and insolvency is not survivable as an admission. Japan's leadership in 1943 and 1944 could read the production tables as clearly as any historian since. The response was to demand more from an economy already committed past the point of sustainability, and to seek a decisive battle that would force a negotiated settlement, because a decisive battle was the only remaining path that did not require anyone to say the word the system could not process. The munitions ministry that Hideki Tojo created on the 1st of November, 1943, and personally headed, was an institutional answer to a problem that had stopped being institutional. The steel did not exist, and no ministry could conjure it. The tribunal that would eventually hang him convicted on two broadly separable bodies of evidence. One was the charge of waging aggressive war. The other was atrocity, and the second body of evidence is the one that is held up. These figures are contested and have to be presented as ranges, because every serious historian working on them presents them that way. Chinese deaths across the war run, in mainstream scholarly estimates, somewhere between 14 and 20 million, with Ron Emitter among those working in that band. Chinese state figures reach considerably higher, to 20 and 35 million and beyond. The Pacific War Online Encyclopedia cites approximately 18 million Chinese civilian deaths as a best archival estimate. Richard Frank and John Dower place total Asia-Pacific War deaths at around 25 million, of which roughly 17 to 19 million were non-Japanese non-combatants. Japanese deaths are estimated by R.J. Rummel at between 1,771,000 and 3,187,000, with a most likely figure near 2,521,000, of which roughly 672,000 were civilians. Deaths from American air raids on Japan are estimated across an extremely wide band, from 241,000 to 900,000, with Dower's figure of approximately 553,000 civilian air raid deaths among the most cited. And then there is the number that did more work at the tribunal than any other. The tribunal found that the death rate among Western prisoners of war in Japanese custody reached 27.1%. For American prisoners specifically, the figure approached 37%. That was about 7 times the death rate for prisoners held by Germany and Italy. Max Hastings quantifies it in Retribution as 35,756 deaths among 132,134 Western Allied prisoners, against roughly 4% of British and American prisoners in German hands. Whatever can be argued about Hideki Tojo's authorship of the war, and a great deal can be argued, these deaths occurred under a command structure he sat at the top of, in a war his cabinet declared, under a set of institutional attitudes toward surrender and captivity that he had spent a career enforcing. The prisoner mortality figure deserves to be sat with rather than passed over, because of how the comparison isolates the variable. German captivity and Japanese captivity were both harsh, both governed by a hostile power in wartime, both subject to shortage as the war turned. The outcomes were not comparable. Roughly 4% against 27.1% is not a difference of degree produced by scarcity. It is the signature of a doctrine. That doctrine was the one Hideki Tojo had administered his entire career, an institutional position holding that surrender was disgrace, that a soldier who allowed himself to be captured had forfeited his standing, and that men who had done so were owed correspondingly little. Applied to one's own troops, that produced the fighting behavior the Pacific War became notorious for. Applied to prisoners, it produced 35,756 deaths among 132,134 Western Allied captives. The defense at Tokyo would spend 225 days contesting the first charge, the charge of waging aggressive war, where the law was genuinely uncertain and 2 judges on the bench agreed it was uncertain. It could do very little with the second. The atrocity evidence did not depend on a contested theory of international law. It depended on bodies, and on the paperwork of the institution that had produced them. Saipan fell on the 9th of July, 1944. The island's significance was measured in aircraft range. Possession of the Marianas placed the Japanese home islands inside the operational radius of American heavy bombers, which meant the war would no longer be fought at a distance from Japanese cities. Hideki Tojo, who by that point held the premiership, the Army Ministry, the Munitions Ministry, and the post of Chief of the Army General Staff, resigned on the 18th of July, 1944. 9 days. The mechanism deserves attention because it is the clearest single demonstration of what his authority actually amounted to. Tojo was not overthrown by a coup. Removal came through the operation of Japan's senior statesmen and court officials, the same informal machinery that had installed him in October of 1941. The system that had appointed the razor to deliver the army unappointed him when the army could not be delivered. Koiso Kuniakai succeeded him as prime minister, with the source chronology dating the formal transfer to the 22nd of July. Tojo spent the remaining 13 months of the war out of power, watching the arithmetic complete itself. Kantaro Suzuki held the premiership when Japan surrendered, and Japan's formal surrender was signed on the 2nd of September, 1945. 9 days after that, American military police arrived at Hideki Tojo's house. On the 11th of September, 1945, Hideki Tojo shot himself in the chest with a Colt pistol. The detail that survives in the physical record is the one that makes the episode difficult to watch across 80 years of distance. Before firing, Tojo had drawn a circle on his chest in charcoal to mark the position of his heart. The pistol is held today by the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. The bullet missed, passing through the 6th and 7th ribs. A Japanese doctor present initially refused to treat him, and American personnel intervened. The intelligence officer Lieutenant John Wilpers is credited in the surviving accounts with forcing medical treatment, and Hideki Tojo's life was saved by American blood transfusions. Consider what that sentence contains. The former Prime Minister of Japan, the man whose cabinet ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor, was kept alive on the blood of the people he had gone to war against, so that they could try him and hang him. Tojo had reportedly intended a different death. The wire services carried a statement in which he said he had wanted to die by the sword, but the pistol had to do, and accepted responsibility for the war. The National World War II Museum records a further statement in which he maintained that the Greater East Asia War had been justified and righteous, and expressed regret toward the nation and the peoples of Asia. Both of these come through contemporaneous press reporting rather than a verified written text, and should be treated as paraphrase. Photographs of Tojo on the stretcher went around the world within days. The occupation had wanted a defendant. What it had produced, in the first week, was a man who had failed at the one act his entire officer culture regarded as the correct response to defeat. The propaganda value ran in both directions, and the Japanese public was watching too. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened on the 29th of April, 1946. The indictment was read on the 3rd of May, and the tribunal sat until the 12th of November, 1948. The scale, as established at the outset, was enormous. 419 witnesses, 4,336 exhibits, depositions and affidavits from 779 further individuals. The prosecution case ran 192 days, the defense 225, and the proceedings spanned roughly 31 months and more than 800 court sessions. 28 men were indicted. 2 died during the trial, the former Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka and Admiral Osemi Nagano, and 1, Shumi Okawa, was found mentally unfit to stand trial. Of the 25 who received judgment, 7 were sentenced to hang. 16 received life imprisonment. Shigenori Togo received 20 years, and Mamoru Shigemitsu received 7. 11 judges sat, with Sir William Webb of Australia presiding. Joseph Keenan of the United States led the prosecution. Hideki Tojo was defended by the Japanese lawyer Ichiro Kiyose and the American George Blewett. And the tribunal carried a problem at its foundation that has never been resolved. The central charge against Tojo and the other Class A defendants was crimes against peace, the crime of waging aggressive war. Richard Minier's Victor's Justice, published in 1971, made the case that has shaped every argument since. The charge was ex post facto, criminalizing in 1946 conduct that was not criminal under international law when undertaken. Minier also attacked the selection of judges, the evidentiary rules, and the fundamental posture of a court in which the victorious powers judged the defeated for conduct the victors were not themselves answerable for. Minier's formulation is that Allied policy was itself in the dock, and his warning is direct, that to regard a trial as a propaganda device is to debase justice. One judge went considerably further than Minier ever would. Justice Radhabinod Pal of India wrote a dissent running 1,235 pages, a document catalogued in the Northcroft collection at the University of Canterbury. Powell argued for the acquittal of every defendant. Powell situated Japanese conduct inside the longer history of Western colonialism in Asia and argued that a tribunal constituted by colonial powers had no standing to characterize Japanese expansion as uniquely criminal. Powell's language for the proceeding was a sham employment of legal process for the satisfaction of a thirst for revenge. Powell was not alone in dissenting. Justice Bert Rolling of the Netherlands filed a partial dissent, holding that several convicted defendants should have been acquitted, including Koki Hirota, who was sentenced to death, while arguing that 3 men who received life imprisonment deserved execution. Justice Henri Bernard of France dissented on procedural grounds, holding that the process was tainted by a defect this account will return to shortly. Justice Delfin Geronilla of the Philippines, a survivor of the Bataan Death March, concurred and argued the sentences were too lenient. Set those 4 positions beside each other, because the spread is the point. On the same bench, at the same trial, on the same evidence, one judge held that every defendant should walk free. One held that a man being hanged should have been acquitted, while 3 men receiving life should have hanged. One held the entire proceeding procedurally tainted, and one held the sentences insufficiently severe. That is not a court arriving at a considered majority. That is a court that could not agree on what it was doing. The Rolling dissent is the one that unsettles most on close reading, because Rolling was no sympathizer and never argued that Japan had been wronged. Rolling accepted the tribunal's basic authority, applied it, and arrived at different answers than his colleagues did, acquitting men the majority hanged and condemning men the majority spared. If the evidence supported outcomes that opposite between 2 judges reading it in good faith, the evidentiary threshold being applied to capital sentences was not doing the work a capital sentence requires. And Powell's dissent, whatever one makes of its conclusions, was not the work of an afternoon. 1,235 pages is a monograph. It represents a judge who sat through 31 months and more than 800 sessions, and then wrote a book-length argument that the entire proceeding had been a mistake in kind rather than in degree. The victor's justice critique is powerful, it is old, and it is not the last word. The most recent specialist scholarship has pushed back hard. Yuma Totani's The Tokyo War Crimes Trial, published by the Harvard University Asia Center in 2008, disputes the victor's justice thesis directly. Totani's argument rests on the documentary achievement of the proceedings. The tribunal assembled an evidentiary record of Japanese conduct in Asia that no other mechanism would have produced, and applied legal principles already established at Nuremberg rather than inventing them for the occasion. Neil Boiterer and Robert Cryer occupy the harder middle ground in the Tokyo International Military Tribunal, a reappraisal, published by Oxford in 2008. Boiterer and Cryer concede the legal defects without flinching. The crimes against peace charge did violate the principle of legality. War crimes proper were treated almost as an afterthought relative to the aggression charge. And yet their conclusion is that the tribunal carried real jurisprudential and historical weight in its own right, emphatically not a footnote to Nuremberg. The honest position is that these arguments do not resolve. The aggression charge was legally weak, and the men who made that objection at the time included 2 of the judges hearing the case. The atrocity evidence was overwhelming, and the record of it survives because this flawed tribunal compiled it. Both of those statements are true at once, and the discomfort of holding them together is the actual historiographical situation rather than a failure to reach a conclusion. Consider what the alternative would have been. Without the tribunal, there is no systematic documentary record of Japanese conduct in Asia assembled while the participants were alive and the paperwork intact. The 4,336 exhibits and the testimony of 419 witnesses exist because a court with real legal defects compelled their production. Totani's defense rests on precisely this, that the record is the achievement and the record is sound. And without the tribunal, there is also no capital conviction on a charge that did not exist as law when the conduct occurred, no chief prosecutor coordinating with a defendant to protect a man the court declined to try, and no 7 executions decided by margins the judges agreed among themselves to conceal. The tribunal produced the evidence base that makes honest history of the Pacific War possible, and it produced it through a process that would not survive contact with the standards it claimed to be establishing. Hideki Tojo took the witness stand on the 26th of December, 1947. The defense he mounted was not evasion. Tojo never claimed ignorance, never attempted to distribute blame downward onto subordinates, and never disowned the war. His position, stated on the record, was that he would contend to the last that it was a war of self-defense. Asked directly whether he had made the decision to attack Pearl Harbor, Tojo answered that he was responsible. At the close of his testimony, he stated that he felt he had done what was right and true. This is documented in the trial record, and precision matters about what it does and does not concede. Tojo accepted responsibility. Tojo did not accept criminality. That distinction is the entire architecture of his defense, and it aligned exactly with the weakest point in the prosecution's case, the ex post facto character of the aggression charge that Munir would later attack, and that Powell and Rowling were attacking from the bench in real time. For 5 days, Hideki Tojo was the most effective defense witness at his own trial. And then, on the 31st of December, 1947, he said something that nearly destroyed the entire architecture of the occupation. Under cross-examination that day, Hideki Tojo testified that it was inconceivable for any Japanese subject to act against the will of the emperor. The statement was true. It was consistent with everything he had said about the constitutional order he had served his whole life. And it was catastrophic because it established, from the mouth of the former prime minister, that the war could not have proceeded without the sanction of a man who was not on trial, who had not been indicted, and whom the occupation had decided in advance would never be indicted. What happened next is documented by John Dower in Embracing Defeat and by Awaya Kintaro in the Asia-Pacific Journal. The chief prosecutor, Joseph Keenan, worked through the imperial court to reach Kido Koichi. Kido urged Tojo to correct the testimony. In early January of 1948, Hideki Tojo revised his statement. Read that sequence again, because it is neither a rumor nor a conspiracy theory. The chief prosecutor of the tribunal coordinated with the defendant, through an intermediary who was himself a defendant, to walk back testimony that threatened a third party the court had agreed not to try. This is the defect that Justice Henri Bernard dissented over. Bernard's procedural objection was that the absence of the emperor from the dock tainted the proceeding, and that the deliberations were flawed. Bernard was not speculating. Bernard was watching it happen. Herbert Bix built the modern scholarly account of this on foundations that had been visible since 1948. Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan won the Pulitzer Prize in 2000 and overturned the older image of a passive, constitutionally constrained monarch. Bix argues that Hirohito was an active, engaged participant in decision-making, that he elevated Tojo because he supported Tojo's policies, and that the post-war settlement deliberately constructed Tojo as the responsible party in order to preserve the throne. Bix's reading is now dominant. It is not unanimous. Critics, including reviewers writing for the Japan Society, argue that Bix credits evidence selectively and leans on inference where documentation runs thin, and other scholars continue to emphasize genuine structural and constitutional limits on what the throne could do. That debate is live, and this account is not going to pretend to settle it. What is not in dispute is the sequence of events in the courtroom between the 31st of December, 1947, and early January of 1948, and what that sequence reveals about the purpose the trial was serving alongside the purpose it announced. Hideki Tojo was convicted for a war. Hideki Tojo was also, in a narrower and better documented sense, positioned. The Hideki Tojo of the last 3 years of his life is a different figure from the Razor, and the details that survive from Sugamo prison are the strangest material in the entire record. The most widely told of them concerns his teeth. In 1946 and 1947, a United States Navy dentist, Lieutenant Junior Grade E. J. Mallory, working with a colleague named George Foster, fabricated a set of upper dentures for Hideki Tojo. Into the inside border of those dentures, Mallory secretly drilled the phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" in Morse code. a line of dots and dashes running along the surface where nobody would look. The prank leaked. On the 14th of February, 1947, Mallory drove through a snowstorm back to the prison to grind the message off before it could be discovered. Mallory told the Associated Press years afterward that it had not been done in anger, and that not many people had the chance to get those words into that particular mouth. The other detail from Sugamo runs in the opposite direction entirely. The prison chaplain was Hanayama Shinsho, a Buddhist priest, and under his guidance Hideki Tojo turned toward Pure Land Buddhism, the Amida tradition. The son of a Buddhist priest's daughter, 63 years old, in the custody of the nation he had attacked, returned to the faith of his mother's family. Hanayama recorded the encounter in a memoir published in 1950, The Way of Deliverance. Tojo left death poems, and the English renderings of them vary so widely between sources that this account will not quote one, because there is no way to know which rendering is faithful. What is documented is what he handed the priest before walking to the gallows: his prayer beads, his glasses, and his false teeth, to be given to Kitsuko. Judgment was delivered on the 12th of November, 1948, and Hideki Tojo was sentenced to death. The vote that produced that sentence has never been officially published, and its reconstruction remains one of the genuine, unsolved problems of the historiography. The tribunal's charter required only a majority of the 11 judges to impose death. The tallies were kept secret, and the judges pledged never to disclose who had voted for execution. The Chinese judge Mei Juao confirmed the existence of that pledge. What exists is a set of incompatible reconstructions. Justice Rowling, writing in the Tokyo trial and beyond in 1994, stated that Hirota's death sentence passed by 6 votes to 5, and named the 5 in opposition as Webb, Bernard, Zarianov, Pao, and himself. The legal scholar Chen Xinyu, writing in the Tsinghua China Law Review in 2017, argues that because Bernard did not participate in the sentencing vote at all, only 10 judges voted, which would make the margins 6-4 on Hirota and 7-3 on Tojo. Douglas Linder's account of the trial cites a range, 7-4 or 6-5. These cannot all be correct. What can be said with confidence is narrow and, in its way, more striking than any specific number. Hideki Tojo's death sentence was not unanimous. Some of the judges hearing the case against the most recognizable defendant of the Pacific War voted against killing him, and the identities and the count are permanently unrecoverable. Hideki Tojo was hanged at Sugamo Prison shortly after midnight on the 23rd of December, 1948, alongside Kenji Doihara, Koki Hirota, Saishiro Itagaki, Haitaro Kimura, Iwane Matsui, and Akira Muto. 6 of those 7 were career military officers. One was not. Koki Hirota had been a civilian, a diplomat, a foreign minister, and a prime minister, and Hirota is the defendant whose death sentence Justice Rowling explicitly argued against and whose margin, by Rowling's own account, came down to a single vote. Whichever reconstruction of the count is correct, Rowling's or Chen Xinyu's, a civilian diplomat went to the gallows on the narrowest arithmetic the tribunal produced. Hirota's execution has been the most persistently criticized of the 7 ever since, and the criticism comes from inside the courtroom rather than from later revisionists. The presence of Hirota on that list is the clearest available answer to the question of what the tribunal was actually punishing. It was not punishing command of atrocities, because Hirota had commanded nothing. The bodies were cremated at Kaboyama, in Yokohama. And then the United States Army did something that stayed classified for more than 70 years. Documents declassified and brought to light in 2021 by the historian Hiroaki Takazawa of Nihon University establish that Major Luther Frierson scattered the ashes from an 8th Army aircraft over the Pacific, approximately 30 miles east of Yokohama. The purpose was explicit. There was to be no grave, no site, no relic, nothing that could become a shrine. The occupation had thought carefully about martyrdom. It did not work. Crematorium residue was reportedly recovered by Japanese associates, among them the defense lawyer Shoei Sanmanji, and taken on the 3rd of May, 1949, to the Kowa Kannon Temple at Atami. The 2 accounts are not necessarily in conflict. Frierson scattered the ashes, and what remained at the crematorium was material of uncertain provenance, and it was enough. On the 19th of April, 1959, a monument of the Seven Warriors was raised at Kowa Kannon, with an inscription by the former Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida. A portion was interred at Mount Sangane in Aichi in 1960. In December of 1971, leftist radicals of the East Asia Anti-Japan Armed Front bombed the Kowa Kannon site. Then, on the 17th of October, 1978, the head priest of Yasukuni Shrine secretly enshrined 14 Class A war criminals, including Hideki Tojo, as Showa martyrs. No physical remains are involved in a Yasukuni enshrinement. The act is spiritual and administrative, and its consequences have been neither. The enshrinement transformed Yasukuni from a national memorial into a permanent diplomatic wound with China and South Korea, and it has stayed one for nearly 50 years. One person's reaction to the 1978 enshrinement remained unknown for almost 30 years. On the 20th of July, 2006, the Nihon Keizai Shimbun published notes made by Tomita Tomohiko, a former Grand Steward of the imperial household. The notes record Emperor Hirohito, speaking in 1988, stating that after the enshrinement, he never worshipped at Yasukuni again, and that this was a matter of his conscience. A corroborating diary entry surfaced in 2007. The memo's authenticity is widely accepted, and it explains a silence that had puzzled observers since 1978. The emperor, whose responsibility Hideki Tojo affirmed on the 31st of December, 1947, and retracted a week later, stopped visiting the shrine on the day it enshrined Hideki Tojo. Tojo's granddaughter Yuko Tojo spent her later years arguing that Japan had fought a war of self-defense rather than aggression and campaigned for constitutional revision. Yuko Tojo ran unsuccessfully for the House of Councilors in July of 2007 and died in 2013. In 1998, the film Pride, The Fateful Moment, presented Tojo sympathetically as a family man defending Asia against Western colonialism. Made on a budget of 1.5 billion yen with backing that included a right-wing businessman, it ranked among the highest-grossing Japanese films of its year and drew accusations of denialism in China, Korea, and Japan alike. Here is what the record supports. Hideki Tojo held more simultaneous offices than any other leader of a major combatant power, and was removed from all of them in 9 days by men whose names most people have never heard. Tojo presided over a decision that the fuel arithmetic had largely made before he arrived in office, and accepted responsibility for it in a courtroom while denying it was a crime. A tribunal that 2 of its own judges considered procedurally illegitimate convicted him on a charge that a 3rd judge, in 1,235 pages, argued should never have existed, and on a body of atrocity evidence that the most recent scholarship still regards as sound. The chief prosecutor helped him revise testimony that pointed at a man the court had agreed not to try, and the count of the judges who sent him to the gallows was sealed by mutual agreement and cannot now be recovered. The propaganda answer was that Hideki Tojo was Japan's Hitler. The scholarship dismantled that decades ago and has not replaced it with anything comfortable. Masao Murayama's phrase was collective irresponsibility, a system in which enormous decisions emerge without anyone having quite decided them. The uncomfortable implication is not that Hideki Tojo was innocent. Tojo enforced that system for 30 years, rose through it, and served as its most capable administrator. The uncomfortable implication is that a structure designed so that no individual is ever responsible will still, when it finally fails, produce exactly one man to hang. And whether that man was the author of the catastrophe or merely the most legible surface it presented has never been settled by the tribunal, by the scholarship, or by the 78 years since.